Imagine waking up in total darkness. You try to move, but you can't. Your chest feels heavy. The air is thick, and every breath feels like it might be your last. For the people in this video, this wasn't a nightmare. It actually happened. They were buried alive, but somehow, against all odds, they survived. Before we begin, if you enjoy true survival stories like these, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories you're about to hear are some of the most unbelievable survival cases ever recorded. Now let's begin. Number 5. In 2015, a construction worker named Carlos Ramirez was working on a sewer project in Mexico City. Carlos had been digging inside a deep trench that was nearly 10 feet underground. The job was routine. Workers had done it hundreds of times before. But that afternoon, something went horribly wrong. Without warning, the walls of the trench suddenly collapsed. Thousands of pounds of loose soil poured down like an avalanche. Carlos didn't even have time to react. Within seconds, he was buried beneath the dirt. Above ground, his co-workers froze in shock. For a moment, everything went silent. Then one of them shouted, "Carlos! Carlos!" But there was no answer. The workers immediately called emergency services and began digging with their hands. Every second mattered, because when someone is buried underground, oxygen quickly runs out. Rescue crews arrived within minutes. They brought shovels, machinery, and thermal detection equipment. But digging too quickly was dangerous. If they moved the soil the wrong way, the entire trench could collapse again. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then suddenly, one rescuer heard something faint. A sound. It was a weak tapping noise. Carlos was alive, trapped beneath nearly 6 feet of dirt. He had somehow managed to create a tiny pocket of air near his face. He had also kept himself calm, slowly tapping on a metal pipe to signal rescuers. After nearly 40 terrifying minutes underground, firefighters finally pulled him out. Carlos was exhausted, covered in dirt, but alive. Doctors later said the small air pocket he created likely saved his life. Without it, he would have suffocated within minutes. Number 4. In 2012, a man named Peter Skillberg was traveling through northern Sweden during winter. Temperatures had dropped to nearly negative 30 degrees Celsius. Peter was driving through a remote forest road when his car suddenly slid off the icy pavement and crashed into a snowbank. At first, it didn't seem serious, but the snowstorm outside quickly worsened. Within hours, massive amounts of snow began piling on top of the vehicle. Soon the car was completely buried. Peter tried to open the doors, but they were frozen shut. He tried breaking the windows, but the snow outside had packed tightly against the glass. He was trapped. Days passed, then weeks. Inside the car, Peter survived by melting snow and conserving what little energy he had. Eventually, the snow surrounding the vehicle created something unexpected, an insulated air pocket. The car essentially became a frozen survival capsule buried under snow. For 2 months, Peter remained trapped inside. Rescuers eventually discovered the vehicle when snowmobilers noticed what looked like the roof of a car buried beneath the snow. When they dug inside, they were shocked. Peter was still alive, weak, dehydrated, but alive. Doctors later said his body had entered a state similar to hibernation, which helped him survive the extreme cold and lack of food. It was one of the most extraordinary survival cases ever recorded. Number 3. In 2018, a man in Brazil named Luciano Ferreira experienced something straight out of a horror movie. Luciano had been kidnapped by criminals who believed he had access to money. When he refused to cooperate, they decided to get rid of him. The attackers drove him to a remote field outside the city. There, they forced him into a shallow grave they had already dug. Luciano begged them to stop, but they ignored him. Within minutes, dirt began pouring over his body. Eventually, his entire body was covered. And then, silence. The kidnappers left, but Luciano wasn't dead. Miraculously, he had managed to keep one arm slightly free near the surface of the soil. Using every ounce of strength he had left, he slowly began digging upward. The dirt was heavy, and every movement drained his energy. But after nearly 30 minutes of digging, his hand finally broke through the surface. A farmer working nearby noticed movement in the dirt and rushed over. What he saw shocked him: a hand sticking out of the ground. The farmer quickly began digging and eventually pulled Luciano out. Luciano was barely conscious, but alive. Police later arrested several suspects connected to the kidnapping. Investigators said Luciano surviving was almost impossible, but that one small gap he kept near his arm made all the difference. Number 2. In 2005, a woman named Mary Vincent experienced one of the most terrifying survival stories in criminal history. Mary had been kidnapped while hitchhiking in California. Her attacker drove her to a remote canyon. After hours of terror, he left her for dead. Mary was thrown into a deep drainage ditch and covered with debris and dirt. Injured and barely conscious, she slowly realized she was trapped. The ditch walls were steep, and the weight of dirt made it nearly impossible to move. But Mary refused to give up. Using incredible determination, she began clawing her way upward. Every movement was painful, but eventually she reached the top of the ditch. She then walked nearly 3 miles along a remote road before finally finding help. Despite everything she had been through, Mary survived and later helped police capture the man responsible. Her story would become one of the most powerful examples of human resilience ever documented. Number 1. Our final story might be the most unbelievable of all. In 1999, a man named Guy Laliberté was working at a construction site when disaster struck. Guy had been operating equipment inside a deep excavation pit when the ground suddenly collapsed. Thousands of pounds of sand and gravel buried him instantly. His co-workers rushed to help, but the collapse had completely covered him. Rescuers believed there was no way anyone could survive under that much debris, but they continued searching anyway. Nearly an hour later, something incredible happened. A rescue dog began barking at one specific location. Workers immediately started digging. Slowly, carefully, they removed layers of sand and rock. Then they found him. Guy was still alive. He had survived by curling his body into a small pocket that formed when a piece of machinery partially shielded him from the collapsing soil. The air pocket gave him just enough oxygen to survive. When rescuers pulled him out, many of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. Guy had been buried alive for nearly an hour. Yet somehow, he made it out. Being buried alive is one of the most terrifying situations imaginable. The darkness, the pressure, the feeling of running out of air. But the stories in this video prove something incredible about the human will to survive. Even in the most hopeless situations, people can find ways to stay alive. Whether it's staying calm, creating an air pocket, or simply refusing to give up. Sometimes survival comes down to one small decision and one final breath. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more unbelievable true survival stories, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be even more unbelievable than the ones you just heard.